Hello, everyone, and welcome to Make It Mindful, the podcast where we explore how to keep schools relevant by looking through the lens of mindfulness and asking the question, what's really worth paying attention to here? I'm your host, Seth Fleischauer. In each episode, I interview educational changemakers, striving to understand what they do, why it works, and how it can lead to practical, transformative solutions for teaching. And this week, my guest is James Anderson. James, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Seth, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to a conversation.
As am I. You sent me your book, Learnership, after we talked the first time, and I think it's a pretty fascinating read. Very detailed, thorough, thought out. I'd love to jump into that with the time that we have here today. I imagine it is impossible for me to satisfy all of my curiosity around it because it's a lot. It's a complete framework, but I am excited for you to be here today and to at least scrape the surface of what you do and why it works. I'm going to read a little bit here about the book, and maybe you can let me know if this is a good kind of summary. But Learnership by James Anderson explores how educators can cultivate a mindset of continuous learning and growth in students. Anderson introduces the concept of learnership, a blend of learning and craftsmanship, which encourages students to take charge of their own learning journeys. The book emphasizes the importance of a growth mindset, focusing on strategies that empower students to overcome obstacles, set and pursue meaningful goals, and develop resilience and perseverance. Would you say that that is a good summary?
Yeah, it is a good summary. I'd add to it that it also tries to set students up to succeed in school, which is obviously important, but also sets those long-term goals so they can thrive in life after school as well. And that's what the skill of learnership tries to do. It tries to future-proof students against that unknowable future that they're confronting.
I love that idea of future-proofing students. It seems that the only constant is change, and it's getting harder and harder to anticipate what the future is going to look like. And so that set of skills that students will need in order to be able to achieve in a world, in any world, right? Like that seems to be the big point of education at the moment, and not all that many people have caught on to that idea quite yet. Can you back up a little bit and just give us a little bit of your background and maybe how you arrived at this place? How did you arrive at Learnership?
Oh, wow. All right. 20-year, 30-year history of education, of my education background into 30 seconds. I was a teacher by training. I thought I was going to be a senior biology teacher. That was sort of where my passion was. I landed in a middle school, discovered I loved the learning a lot more than I loved the teaching. And I loved being with the kids and watching them actually learn. And so I started getting interested. I got engaged in what was called the thinking curriculum here in Australia for a while. And I found Art Costa and Bennett Kalik's habits of mind, these dispositions that drive learning. And that took me to a state national action research project that I was involved in. And that connected me with Carol Dweck's work, and that connected me with Anders Ericsson's work. And all along this journey was this idea of what does it take to develop skills, talents, abilities. And learnership is the culmination of that journey, that trying to understand the way the learner engages in the learning process. Because, I was saying to you before the interview, I was standing on stage recently with John Hattie, and John Hattie's visible learning work is all about how we teach, and it's great work. And we've spent 10, 15 years focusing on the skill of teaching, the skill of teaching, the skill of teaching. And while that's been happening, students have been sort of sitting back and waiting to be taught rather than waiting to be waiting to learn or engaging in learning. So this work around learnership is about how learning and teaching partner together, that we can have great teachers, and we do have great teachers in our classroom. But great teachers, as John Holt told us, learning is not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of learners, and learnership describes how we skillfully engage in that process of learning.
Yeah, that was actually one of the quotes that I wrote down here. Learning is not the product of teaching. It is the product of the activity of learners. Let's unpack that a little bit. Another thing that you said was that, we have an understanding of what quality teaching looks like. We don't really have an understanding of quality learning. You mentioned a couple of thinkers, though, that you were exposed to. Is learnership a an amalgamation of research that you've done mixed with practice over the years? Is it something new and different? Is this new fertile ground for how learners actually operate, or have you just pulled a bunch of stuff together in a way that is more actionable for teachers?
A little bit of both. I think the concept of learnership, the idea that we clarify the role of the learner and we think about learning not just as an act that we do, but rather than an act we do skillfully, and we can actually improve the way we learn, not just what we are learning, but how we engage in the learning process. A lot of teachers, a lot of school leaders that I work with find that idea really refreshing, that we sort of stop talking about learning as a one-dimensional thing. I think it's also true to say that what I brought together is, yeah, absolutely, standing on the shoulders of giants. And the thing I love, there are four people that I draw on heavily, or four bodies of work that are led by four people. Carol Dweck's work around mindset, which is basically the understanding you're capable of growth and change. Art Costa and Bennett Kalic's work, which is the idea that there are a set of dispositions that drive you forward as you confront problems you don't immediately know the solutions to. The work of Anders Ericsson, who I think is one of the people that is so underrated and understood, can I say that, in education. You might have heard his work, or your listeners might have heard his work through the 10,000 hour rule. He was the world's expertise expert, and he described that journey of stretching and challenging yourself to improve. And the other one is Nicholas Taleb. And Nicholas Taleb wrote a book, or a series of books. One of them was called Anti-Fragile. And the thing that I love about those four authors is that none of them are good ideas. They're all observations of the real world. Carol Dweck didn't make up mindsets. She noticed that some kids think, I just can't change much, and other kids think, oh no, effort pays off. And she said, what happens? Art Costa and Bennett Kalick did the same thing. They looked at highly successful people through other people's research and said, what behaviours, what dispositions do they have in common? So it's real. Ericsson did the same thing. He said, experts, have you always been really good at what you do? And they said, no, we were beginners once. And he said, well, what's the process you went through? And Taleb looked at the world and said, well, what makes systems thrive? And he described this concept of being anti-fragile. And what I've tried to do is to bring those four ideas together into a framework that is actionable and meaningful and connects to what teachers and school leaders do on a day-to-day basis, in trying to, as I said earlier, set kids up to succeed in school and thrive in life in an educational environment that has been largely focused on teacher practice, in an environment where, we've spent so long trying to understand what quality teachers do, and then basically saying, well, if we know what quality teachers do and kids aren't learning, well, we haven't got very good teachers, have we? And part of my, and then we get that blame and the pressure, and we know teachers are leaving the profession in droves because they feel this pressure and all the rest of it. And one of the things I say in the book is that, we know what quality teaching looks like, and we have great teachers. And when we've got great teachers, but we don't have the learning outcomes we're looking for, then we don't have a teaching problem. We've got a learning problem. And Learnership tries to work out what that learning problem is and offer schools a solution to it.
Yeah, I love it. I love it that it's the student's fault. And
that's not what I said.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, and I want to. What's that?
So it's worth saying that it's not a blame shifting exercise. I have a cartoon that I use sometimes, and you might have seen it. I should know the original author's name of the cartoon, but I taught my dog to whistle. But I don't hear the dog whistling. I said, well, I taught him. I didn't say he learned anything. And I think every teacher's had this experience. Like, we know from John Hattie's work that the effect size of effective feedback is high, 0.89, some big number that, really important. And teachers have been trained in giving effective feedback. And I think every teacher listening to you today will be saying, look, I know how to give good feedback. And they've had a moment like this where they've composed some feedback, and it's been actionable, it's been timely, it's been specific, it's had all those great qualities, and they've just gone, geez, I'm a good teacher. Look at this feedback. This is exactly what quality feedback looks like. And they're sort of handing it to the student on this platter going, watch the magic happen. And the student's going, oh, yeah, whatever, and hasn't paid any attention to it. And that's what we're talking about, that we need the quality feedback, the quality action from the teacher, but we also need the student to play their role. And
Yeah.
it's a partnership. And when we get that partnership where skillful teaching meets skillful learning, then we maximize growth. And that's what the focus of the book's about. It's not about, achieving any particular one goal. It's about maximizing growth in students.
And the book is obviously it's for teachers, right? Or is it for students?
School leaders. School
Okay,
leaders more
yeah.
than
School
yeah.
leaders. Okay. So when you're going in and you're working as a educational consultant with a school, and where is the school starting and where are you looking to take them?
Where the school starts depends on the school. We have a diagnostic we use, and it looks at the learning behaviours in the school at the moment. And what we typically find, and obviously it varies, is that I define 6 levels of learnership, from the non-learner, which is the kid who doesn't do anything at all, doesn't participate. Baseline, there's not a lot of that. They're the beginning learners that see learning as a series of activities, and when the activity's finished, the learning's finished. It doesn't matter what the results were, and they'll go for the easy options, their path of least resistance. The performance learners that do their best, but at the expense of not stretching to do them to do better. Then there's the directed learners who basically do what they're told. Independent learners who can take charge of the learning process and drive, they're the goal setters. And then there's what I call agile learners that are out there embracing challenges for the opportunity it gives them to grow. And when we run this diagnostic, what we typically find are most of the behaviours that we see in classrooms are to the left. They tend to be associated with non-beginning and performance learners. And there's a big step between the directed learners that, being told, this is what you've got to do, and the independent learner. And that big step is often about students not understanding the nature of challenge, not wanting to feel that discomfort that comes with struggling with something they don't immediately know the answer to. And so where we often start, not always, is we start with mindset, which is the understanding you're capable of growth, and that feeling of struggle isn't a sign of deficit, it's actually what you've got to lean into. And then we start with understanding the nature of challenge. And to borrow a term from Adam Grant, who's just written a fantastic book called Hidden Potential, we try to create the students so they become creatures of discomfort. We all understand what creatures of comfort are, and I think we recognise that many of our students want to stay comfortable. They don't want that stretch and challenge and uncertainty that comes with going into what I call the learning zone. And what we do is we make that learning zone explicit. We talk about it should feel uncomfortable. You're not meant to know the answer in this task. Not in every task all day, every day. But for the next hour, while we go into your learning zone, this is what it should feel like. And you're expected to make mistakes. Some of the schools that I work with to help kids overcome that, I don't want to make mistakes thing, introduce mistakes quotas for this period of time, like when we're in our learning zone. Not in the test. In the test, no mistakes. Not when you're doing easy stuff. They're careless mistakes. But in this learning zone, these are the expectations. And we start with that idea of challenge. And as I say, that I wish I'd coined the term creatures of discomfort, but it's not. It's Adam Grant's, and he did a great job of it.
I'm struck by the idea that it is, like, I've heard this before. The idea that we should embrace failure, right? Like it's something that a lot of people like Adam Grant, or my commencement speech when I graduated from Princeton in 2001 was Garrison Keillor, and here's a group of high achieving Princeton students, and his message for us, which I remember to this day, was strive for failure, right? Like if you are a bunch of kids who have done nothing but achieve your entire lives, and you will get it is a ticket to a midlife crisis to do anything but strive for failure, right? And that really stuck with me. It strikes me that there is a huge gap between telling someone that, directing the learner to that, and having the learner independently or with agility incorporate that into their approach to learning. And I'm wondering how you bridge that gap.
Yeah, I wouldn't say strive for failure. I think that misses the point a little bit, and so I might expand on it. I would strive for struggle. I would absolutely
Hmm.
strive for struggle. I would lean into that struggle, in the sense of JFK. We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. There is no growth without struggle. So I think striving for struggle is what we should be doing. This whole idea of embracing failure and all the rest of it, I get it. Like, we're not so dissimilar in age. I might have a few years on you, but we're not so dissimilar in age. We might remember that when we were at school, don't make mistakes. You're going to got to get things right. And what that did was it stigmatized mistakes and made us fear going into our learning zone, which is where the growth happens and the mistakes happen. And I get it. Like, some mistakes are bad. Some failures are serious. You can't have a car accident and go, what a great learning opportunity that was. Like, so in my book, one of the things I do, we recognize that we swung the bar too far, or the pendulum too far the other way. We used to say mistakes were bad. Now we say they're good. And there was a teacher I worked with probably 5 or 6 years ago now, and we were talking about this idea of mistakes. And he said, above my board in my classroom, we have a banner that says, we make magnificent mistakes. And I get what he was trying to do, but I really hope that his students don't grow up to be pilots or surgeons.
Yeah.
You know, so one of the things I do, I mentioned before these zones. We talk about a comfort zone, which is within our abilities, a performance zone, which is our current peak performance. And then we talk about our learning zone. And our learning zone is where we go beyond our current abilities, and it's where growth happens. When we talk about mistakes, we talk about where the mistakes happen. And I define 6 different types of mistakes. There's careless mistakes, mistakes you make through lack of concentration that don't give you useful information. When a 12-year-old forgets to put a full stop on the end of a sentence, no one's gathering the class around and saying, kids, come on, join in. Let's see what we can learn from that. Like, you had already learnt that. That's not new information for you. We talk about performance mistakes, and performance mistakes happen in your performance zone and should be avoided. We should do everything in our power to avoid that. When I'm running a business, I don't want to run the thing into the ground and say, great learning opportunity. It wasn't. It was a failure. And a failure isn't a sign of growth. It might be a sign of an opportunity to grow. It might be a sign of a place where you can put your energies and resources to achieve more in the future. But it is a failure at that point in time. What I define as well is then 3 types of mistakes that, instead of being good or bad, I talk about them being helpful or not helpful. And there are 3 sorts of mistakes that are helpful. They're stretch mistakes, which are the sort of mistakes that you deliberately go into your learning zone knowing that you don't know how to do it, and expecting that as you fumble your way through, things are going to go wrong. And that's the sort of mistake that I think your commencement lecturer was trying to say, that it's not the failure you want to embrace. It's the mistakes that you create in that environment where you're trying to move forward. And the idea is that if you can make better mistakes, then you're going to grow even more. And so that's why the sort of piece de resistance of mistakes, the gold standard of mistakes, is what I call a design mistake. And that's when you think like a scientist and you create an environment with low consequences, but high information. We often hear the Edison example. Edison had found 999 ways a light globe didn't work. Well, yeah, but he wasn't just going, that one doesn't work, try another one. That one doesn't work, try it. He wasn't just randomly going through trying to find one that worked.
Yeah, it was
He
agile
thought like a
development,
scientist.
right?
That's right. And
Yeah.
so he controlled the variables, and every mistake gave him the most possible information. So to come back to where we started, um, this idea that we've got to get used to making mistakes and love mistakes and embrace failure. No, there are times when mistakes are bad, and we need to recognise when those times are, and those times that are in performance situation. When we're in a learning situation, when we're deliberately putting ourselves beyond our current abilities, those mistakes can be useful, not good or bad. They can provide us with information that helps us move forward. And when we flip that narrative from good and bad mistakes to useful or helpful and unhelpful mistakes, and recognize that we want information from those mistakes, then it gives us that way of saying, well, actually, you're right. When that student comes up to us, I don't want to make mistakes, we can say that's a really good attitude
Hmm.
when you're
I like that.
performing.
Yeah, because it's I like the updated thinking around it. The nuance is important, and I think what you're suggesting is that the nuance isn't of itself enough to get over that bridge from thinking that mistakes are like being seeped in a culture where failure is bad, and so you're doing everything that you can to avoid it, and therefore manifesting it by being so nervous about it, versus one where you're just willy nilly, all mistakes are good. Let me just crash the plane now. In your experience, is awareness of those different types of mistakes, the helpful versus not helpful mistakes, is that enough to sort of pop the bubble of the culture around failure?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you a story. I was sitting right here at this desk at this camera, and I sent an email off to one of my partnership schools, and it came straight back. And they said, "Oh, James, are you at your computer? Can we zoom in now?" I said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So I jumped onto this call, and one of the teachers I worked with was saying, "James, I have to tell you this story. I was just in my grade 3 classroom, and one of my students made a mistake." And he just went, "Oh, it's all right. Everyone makes mistakes, like we've taught them to do." And the teacher just leaned in and said, "Was that a helpful mistake?" And the teacher's telling the story about it, and the student's going, "Nah, that was one of those careless mistakes. I shouldn't have made that mistake, should I?" And
Hmm.
straight away, he's realized that it's not just okay to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Some mistakes help us move forward, some don't. And in this case, that one didn't help him move forward. He shouldn't have made it. And you use the word nuance. I think I would like to think what I bring to learning in learnership is that nuance, that detail, that sophistication around how we learn, because we have that in teaching. Like we understand the nuance, the sophistication of what quality teaching looks like. And learnership is all about building in that sophistication, that nuance, that detail into learning to allow us to be more effective learners, to get better at getting better.
Hmm. I love it.
I do too.
What else? So this seems like a somewhat like I'm always looking for these practical transformative solutions for teaching. This framework of helpful versus not helpful mistakes feels like one of those touch points where someone can listen to this podcast, pull this out as inspiration, and affect their impact in the classroom simply based on knowing and understanding that fairly simple idea. I'm wondering what else you've got for us. You have more of those within learnership?
Oh, yeah, look, how long we got? Uh, Look, there's a whole range of things we talk about. I think when I talk about learnership, I talked before briefly about those 6 levels. And I think, well, I know that when teachers recognize those 6 levels of learnership, they can quickly recognize which level the students are at. And that gives them insight into why they're learning a particular way, how they're responding, what they need to do to move to the next level. And I talk about how to move students to the next level.
Hmm.
I think one of the other things I do with Carol Dweck's work that's been really powerful in schools is most of the way Carol Dweck's work is talked about in education is fixed and growth. And the mistake we've made is to teach kids about it rather than teaching for the mindset. And so what we've done in schools is sort of said, fix is terrible, growth is great, have one of those growth ones, please, away you go. And we put up the posters and the slogans and all the rest of it. One of the models I've done is I've described the continuum between fixed and growth, and to recognise we're not fixed, we're not growth. There's a continuum in between. And what we need to do is not to instill or install or adopt a growth mindset, but rather we need to nudge and nourish and nurture an increasingly growth-orientated mindset. So I provide tools and strategies and what I call nudges to change the messaging we give to kids so they become more growth-orientated and understand themselves as learners. So the mindset's the foundation. The stuff I talked about before about the zones is really powerful. I've got a early primary teacher teaching 5 and 6 year olds that I was talking to just a couple of weeks ago, and she routinely now talks about when kids are in their comfort zone, performance zone, learning zone, or even their aspirational zone, which is way beyond their current abilities, and the different expectations in each. When they're in their comfort zone, it should feel easy. It should be straightforward. They should feel like just ticking it off, getting through it, not making mistakes. When they're in their performance zone, they're meant to concentrate, meant to minimize mistakes and produce their current best performance. But when they're in their learning zone, that's when mistakes can be helpful. That's when they're not meant to know the answer immediately. So Melissa, put your hand down if you know it straight away. You're not in your learning zone. And so students are being more targeted around the way they learn. They're being more, they've got more clarity around how they're meant to behave and how they're meant to respond in those different zones. And then we can go and we talked about the mistakes. I've got a matrix around the different types of effort. Most kids think effort is about the amount of time and energy they spend on something. They think it looks like, and this is not going to work for the people on the podcast, but I think it looks like this. Constipation.
I think they can see that with the sound.
And then there's the so there's the effort, the mistakes, and the habits of mind, which is not my work. That's Art Costa and Bennett Kalik's work. But I give that a life that makes it really practical in the classroom. So I would like to think, in answer to your question, that I've got lots of models, lots of practical tools and strategies to help teachers, help kids become better learners. Not for the teachers to be better teachers, but to help the kids be better learners.
And so when you're engaging with a school, you're going through the principal, getting the principal to like sign on to this idea, and then doing a series of workshops with teachers. I'm wondering how someone goes, because it's there's so much here. It's so rich, right? Like you're pulling together multiple frameworks. You've got, all these different types of effort. You've got all these different types of learners, these learning zones that people are in, helpful mistakes versus unhelpful mistakes. As a teacher, I'm almost like, do I need like to take a college course on this in order to be able to like really, implement it in a way that's going to be meaningful? But I'm wondering what you find is like, what's the necessary amount of engagement that a teacher needs to have with your training, with your book, with the principal who's putting forth your ideas, in order to get to the point where they're like, I think I've got this and I can now implement it with confidence in my classroom?
Yeah. All right. So there's a range of answers there. First off, I've spoken to many teachers who have picked up learnership, picked up key ideas like the zones or the habits or something else, and made a difference with that one part. And I think that's really important to recognise that it's not an all or nothing thing. You can take parts of this and work with it. Particularly the mindset stuff is really powerful and relatively easily implemented in your own classroom. The real power comes when we work at a whole school level. And you're right. What I typically do is I build partnerships with schools. And often that will look like I'll work for a year, running after school workshops or holiday workshops, whatever works, to sort of front load the information. But just like you wouldn't try to teach reading or music or maths in a year, you can't teach kids to be skillful learners in a lesson at the start of the year. It's something you've got to build the understandings of. So typically after I sort of taught the concepts, the second year is about implementing them in a scope and sequence and
Hmm.
saying, what do we teach the early primary kids? What do we teach the middle school kids? What do we teach the senior kids? Where's our focus there? Because you're right, in one hit, it's a lot for one teacher to do, and one teacher will never do it. Just like one teacher never teaches language, we've got someone teaching the basics, and we've got building the next steps and the next
Mm.
steps. And so I've got a online resource that sort of works through, if you're at this level, this is the part you focus on. If you're at this level, you focus on this. And the big shift from a school's perspective is to shift from what we've got at the moment in schools is this culture, a what default way of doing things in schools. It's about teaching and assessment. It's this culture of performance and culture of teaching. Everything's driven by that. And the shift we try to make is to develop a culture around learning and growth. And there's a whole lot of stuff we do in there.
Yeah. Is is this to a certain extent like one size fits all? Like, is this something that everyone, every learner, every school can benefit from? Or are there types of learners that do well with this and others that don't as much?
It's not a one size fits all, except to say that every learner can improve the way they go about learning. So, for example, I was speaking to a school yesterday and we looked at their diagnostic, and they had a very particular diagnostic, which was, had a big step between the directed learner and independent learner. And that says to me that that's where we needed to start.
Hmm.
Another school that I work with in another part of Australia, their diagnostic was hard to the left. Like it was full of non-learning and beginning learning behaviours. And that said we had to start somewhere else. We had to start with mindset. We had to have, a lot of these
Hmm.
kids were sort of resigned to, oh, I'm just not smart enough, I'm not good at school. And that was all a mindset issue. Whereas this school I was talking to yesterday was about, no, they understand they can learn, but they're relying on the teacher to teach them.
Hmm.
And so they needed to shift that responsibility. So it's funny that you should say, does it suit one type of learner? Well, I would say, depending on the current level of learnership of that particular learner, changes our starting point. But we're all learners and we can all get better at learning. And I think that's true of the adults in the school as well. That one of the harder lessons to learn for some teachers is that you can be an expert teacher, really, really good teacher, but that doesn't necessarily make you an expert learner. And as one of my principals put it, the I do, we do, you do model of teaching and learning is limited by the I do part when it
Hmm.
comes to teaching the learning process. And for some of us as teachers, we actually have to start to understand the learning process in more detail. I'd love to tell you a story. Can I tell you a story here that
Please.
illustrates this? A lot of teachers these days think they're responsible for learning. I had a first year teacher come up to me at the end of one of my workshops recently. And he said, and I've been talking the whole day about the role of the learner and how they engage in the learning process and all the rest of it. And this is a first year teacher. And he's come up to me and he said, James, I can't believe what I did yesterday. In light of what you've just said, I've got to tell you this. I said, what did you do? And he said, I had a 8, 9-year-old girl that didn't want to take a test. I think we can all relate to that. And he said to this 8 or 9-year-old girl, I said, you don't have to worry about this test. I just need to give you this test to see if I've taught you properly. This first year teacher was coming into the system thinking that his impact was the only factor that was a measure
Hmm.
of the student's learning, that if the student didn't learn, that was his fault. And so what we're talking about here is what that role of the learner is and what they do.
Hmm. Is there like a type of education, because you're talking about, like, the ultimate learner is an
Yeah.
agile learner who can take their learning ability, learning style, and apply it to any given situation. that implies a certain type of curriculum. The fact that the fourth step is directed learning and that happens to be the kind of standard method of teaching, and it's not it's not at the top of the ladder, right? So
Yeah.
it implies that there are certain pedagogies that align with your framework, and others that might align but are not optimal. Would you say that that's good? And in other words, you mentioned at the top, like, we know what good teaching is. James Anderson, what is good teaching?
Yeah. Um, I'd actually flip that question around a little bit. I think we know that to set kids up for a world where they can thrive and to get the really rich outcomes we're looking for, we want to set those rich, open-ended tasks, the problem-based learning, the messy stuff, the stuff that Jay McTighe, Grant Wiggins talk about, and understanding by design, and so many others talk about in that same framework. The problem is that to set those rich, open-ended, self-directed tasks, the entry price is a particular level of learnership. If you come in and say, "Oh, we know that rich tasks; these are what we want to do, kids. Let's give you a passion project." And I think passion projects and the idea of letting kids pursue what they want to pursue and so forth is a good idea. But if you say to "What's your passion project?" to a student who is at the non-level learning of learnership, they'll say, "I don't want to do it."
Hmm.
If you say it to someone at the beginning level of learnership, they'll say, "Oh, can I do that really easy thing?" If you offer a passion project to someone that's at the performance level of learnership, they'll say, "Oh, can I do the project I did last year? I did that really well." Can you hear that?
We'll cut it out.
Yeah. The garbage truck going through the background.
Yeah.
When you offer a passion project to someone at the directed level of learnership, they go, "I don't know, what do you think I should do?" And it's not until you get to that level of independent or agile learning where you can offer a student a passion project, an open-ended, messy task, and they know what to do with it.
Hmm.
So in terms of the approaches you take, I think the issue is not, what's the right approach. It's about getting kids to the level of learnership that allows them to engage in those rich, open-ended problems.
Hmm. Oh, I like that. So it's not necessarily that there's one pedagogy that will get you all the way, and everyone should follow that pedagogy. It's that within the different levels of learnership, there are different types of approaches that will work based on where the student is within the framework.
Yeah.
That makes
And you
sense.
try to raise the level of learnership to a point where you can engage in that really rich, open-ended type tasks, the really challenging tasks that are going to drive
Yeah.
growth.
Yeah, and I think that's a great it's a great sort of litmus test, or checklist of a framework for a teacher to think about when they want to do that passion project with their students, right? Like, it's like, let me think about where my students actually are, and let me not just like bring my expectations of what I'd love for them to do into this, and spout some progressive educational thing that I read in a textbook and just think that it's going to work in my classroom when I haven't really thought about where they're at and what they can accomplish quite yet. Yeah, I think that's great. Okay, so one more question is, and we talked about this a little bit in our time when we weren't recording, is um, these different levels of learnership. My understanding is that we need different types of teachers at the different levels of learnership, right? So can you kind of take me through that hierarchy from the bottom all the way up to the top? What's the role of the teacher in getting them from each rung of the ladder to the next one?
Yeah, I think when you recognize the level of learnership you've got in a particular group of students, and it will vary obviously, you've got to adopt a particular style to move them to the next rung. And so if you've got lots of kids that are non-learners, the kids that are opting out, doing nothing, then to get them from non-learner to beginning learner, you need to be like a benevolent dictator. Someone who says, "Get off your lazy and get to work." And Some teachers do that really well. If you're at the beginning learner stage and you want to get students to performance learners, you need someone who acts a bit more like a supervisor. And a supervisor is saying, well, you're doing stuff, but you've got to do it well. Here's the standard, and they make sure you meet a standard. To get kids from that performance learner level to directed learner, you need a traditional teacher. Someone will say, these are the instructions, follow my instructions. This is what you do. But once you've got kids at that directed learner level, to get them from that directed learner to the independent learner level, you need someone who acts more like a coach. And a coach is someone who's really interested in the process. For example, when I wrote Learnership, I had to get a coach to help me with my book. And he didn't care about the content. Like he said, you know your content, James. But what he was interested in was the process I was going through to write a really good book. And hopefully that's what he's helped me do. But when you've got someone who understands themselves as a learner, that can engage in the learning process effectively, you don't need a coach anymore. To get from that independent learner to agile learner, what you need is someone that acts more like a mentor. And what a mentor does is points out and provides the opportunity for challenge that's going to drive that growth. And I want to be quick to add here that I'm not suggesting that teachers should go out and all strive to be like mentors, because what you need to do is to match the level of learnership that your students are at. You can imagine the teacher that's like the mentor that's providing these rich challenges and go and try that in a room full of kids that are beginner and non-learner levels. Like they'll come in and go, come on kids, what do you want to do today? And all the kids will go, nothing, thanks, sir. And it won't go anywhere. And by the same thing, I don't want to make it sound like the teacher that's the benevolent dictator isn't a good teacher. You need to be, if you've got kids that aren't doing anything, you need to do something to get them to the next level. But the important thing is that you learn to shift gears. Mm-hmm. And as you go, you lift students up to that next level of learnership.
What I love about that, James, is it feels like an answer to a debate I've been having like in every episode of this podcast ever, which is around like, you know, we have these ideas of progressive education and they really do kind of speak to that mentor level, right? Like we want to turn students into independent learners, into agile learners, people who are in charge of their own stuff, their own path, their own learning experience. But how do we get them there? And you've got an answer for that. And it doesn't involve being that super progressive educator from the start. You have to kind of build up some of those more traditional skills. I mean, you started with an authoritarian skill, right? The benevolent dictator, you know, and it's, I think that the ability to switch between those modes is what's going to make a fantastic teacher. And unfortunately, with the degree of variability within any given classroom, you might have to be all 6 of those things on any given day, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a tough task, but if you can identify that that's what you're doing, I mean, that's the first step towards doing it, right?
Absolutely. And I think what an enormous praise to say I've answered the question you've had with every speaker. That's on every podcast. I should add, and we may not be recording anymore, when I say benevolent dictator, as in my sort of personality, I was like, you get off your lazy butt and do this. I see primary school teachers in particular that are benevolent dictators by going, oh, I love it when you do that. Can you do more of that for me, please? Like you can do it in a loving way. It's not a
yeah, that's the benevolent part.
Yeah. I wanted to make sure the benevolent part got through.
Your book is available on Amazon and other places. It has recently been translated into Romanian. So if there are any listeners in Romania, they can find that.
Every author's dream.
Is there anywhere else where you would like our listeners to find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. My website, jamesanderson.com.au. You can get the audiobook, obviously, from any good audiobook supplier as well. And it's available as an ebook from Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all those sorts of places as well. So love to reach out and chat to anybody who's interested in taking the work further. But grab the book. There's a free link to the diagnostic. You can run the diagnostic with your school and with your class and look at the level of learnership of your kids and just ask yourself the question, how much easier would your life be and how much better would your students' results be if you could teach them how to be better learners?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here. I think we did sufficiently scratch the surface and maybe a couple layers underneath that. I really appreciate the amount of work you've done in not only researching, but being really reflective and mindful of your own experience as a teacher and as a learner, and pulled all that together into a framework that that teachers can use, that leaders can use to make sure that we are not just teaching, but also facilitating learning in a way that can optimize our student success in a world that is constantly changing. I think it's really important work. So thank you for being here. Any last words of inspiration for our listeners?
Look, I think what we're trying to do here is raise the status of learning in our schools from an act to an art. And when we do that, we set students up to not just succeed in school, but thrive in life. And Seth, I want to thank you for sharing my work, but the work of so many others with such a wide community in the educational space. And the work you do is fantastic. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we have a ton of links in the show notes. You mentioned, I think, 10 different thinkers, so we'll try to gather as many of those links as we can, in addition to the links to your work. Thank you, as always, to our editor, Lucas Salazar, and to my advisor, Deirdre Marlowe. And remember that if you would like to bring positive change to education, we must first make it mindful. See you next time.